kind of a culmination. Now, obviously, I didn't start off as a decolonial political theorist, but I kind of started off doing kind of political theory. My master's was in ideology and discourse analysis at Essex, and then I went to do a PhD in a similar program. So I've always been interested in two aspects. One has been the kind of a critique of Eurocentricism, but secondly is how that critique plays itself out in what I would call sort of the kind of grand politics, which often got neglected. So when I was, a lot of the literature on critiquing Eurocentrism at the time tended to focus on cultural production, which is incredibly, or artistic production, which is really, really important and interesting. But it was my more kind of interest on what really questions of state, questions of power, questions of world order. So that's been my kind of trajectory. And I've been very fortunate and graced, to be able to pursue that in a more or less consistent pattern over many universities and continents.
So maybe the first really point of departure for conversation, you have been working recently on Islamophobia, and in particular, I wanted to really get into the definition that's been adopted by the all-parliamentary group that really created a new grounds for how we conceive and approach Islamophobia. So could you give us at least a path to how did we get into that definition and why is it so important?
Okay. I think it's worth talking a little bit about the process and what the aims was. In Britain, there was a all-party parliamentary group, which is consisted of members from all the main parties actually, who wanted to come up with a definition of Islamophobia that they would then propose that becomes the basis of legislation. And so the idea they had was that if we can get a legally binding definition, we would be able to resolve the problem of Islamophobia because there'll be possibility of legal redress. Now, myself and my colleague Abdul Karim Vakil had a slightly different view of how change in the field of racism has happened historically in the sort of global north. And we were not convinced that the beginning of the process is a legal process, because you still have to be able to train judges to read a case. So it's not just having a legal definition, it's actually being able to see the legal profession to be able to understand that definition as saying and doing this thing. So our kind of contention was that the way to really move this is to not so much have a legally binding definition, because that's the work second stage, but really to have as a definition which in one sentence 10-year-old children could understand. So the idea was to actually generalize in society an understanding of Islamophobia, which did enough work so that people could lock onto it and understand it without having to exceptionalize it, without having to say it is something peculiar or specific. So the definition basically says that Islamophobia is a type of racism that targets the expressions of Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. And it was important to have it linked to the notion of racism because that rested on 50 years in the UK of really, trenchant anti-racist work. That in a way that we've moved from a position in which most organizations, most people of liberal conviction, or most conservative would never even admit racism was a problem or racism actually existed, to an issue that now people accept there is racism. It's just that they're not sure what the boundaries might be. And some places people are even talking about institutional racism. Now, as you know, Hatem, institutional racism comes from Stokely Carmichael's the book in 1966, I think, or mid 60s. So you think about how a concept coined by a Black Panther theorist enters almost the kind of normative lexicon of functioning global North democracies. So it was to see how to create a situation in which Islamophobia could be empowering that Muslims who don't have the possibility of the same kind of structural position that you and I may enjoy, who are not necessarily working full time in education, etc., but will be able to say, well, this is what Islamophobia is. And they will be able to, other non-Muslims who also want to call this out. So by tacking onto racism, it allowed you to do that. The other thing that we did, which was kind of different, was to focus not on Muslimness. Mm-hmm. I mean, everyone knows that the first victim of Islamophobia after 9/11 in the United States was a Sikh man, a turban Sikh man. Now, you could argue, well, it's because, racists have never been very fluent about the niceties and things like that. But there was an issue here that it wasn't the fact that he was a Muslim, but it was that there was a taint of Muslimness. Now, similarly, we know that's what's happening in France, for example. After the legislation banning Muslim school pupils from wearing the hijab, it now became an issue about the length of skirts. You can't have too long skirts. So there's a mobile idea of what constitutes Muslim, what is the marker of Muslim identity. So the other thing was that it was really to talk about not so much the sterile debate about, oh, can I criticize Islam or not? Or is this Muslim or not? But to say, look, in society, Muslimness is something that people can reflect upon, they can feel it, they can understand it. It doesn't mean it's necessarily a Muslim. It doesn't mean that it's canonically sound, but it has a certain tinge to it. And that's what Islamophobia was. So we wanted a one-sentence definition, which we would hope would help propel an argument that Islamophobia is racism and leverage the position that we're in, that there are very few people, even racists, don't want to be called racist nowadays. So the argument was that if you did that, you won on this step. And the second issue was that a lot of organizations in Britain, at least, have protocols around racism, against racism, public organizations, large companies there. So if you say, look, you've already got the machinery to deal with these issues, all you have to do is understand Islamophobia as part of that machinery. So I think that's the kind of logic that we had, to see it as beginning of a struggle rather than basically an appeal to Parliament to pass legislation, which, given the makeup of this government, which contains many self-confessed neocons and and is not known for its friendliness towards Muslimness, it was unlikely that they would prioritize such a position. So that was the main thrust of the definition.
How was the reception of it, both in academic circle and policy circle, and has it moved from the initial introduction to broader adoption, especially from the organizations that have an anti-racist or counter-racist structure to them?
Well, I think it's been mixed. I think in some ways, a lot of the local governments, especially local authorities, which have, let's say, a commitment against Islamophobia, have taken it on. They've tried to incorporate that in their training. It's become, most organizations have tried to at least make a gesture towards it. And I suppose the other context has been the struggle around the IHRC so-called definition of anti-Semitism. So it's been a good way for a lot of organizations to balance out the pressure they felt to adopt one definition to put there. The opposition to it, came from the usual quarters. As you know, there's a kind of a network of neocon opinion makers, publications, and anything to do with any kind of assertion of Muslimness as something that is not something that they favor. So it was a usual kind of thing. And then, unfortunately, there was, there were people within the Muslim community, again, some who had genuine problems. And one of the main problems was, and I think, well, how can Islamophobia be a type of racism when Muslims are a race?
That connection that's always being argued.
And the problem is this, that the education system in Britain and the United States, starts off with the assumption that the existence of races leads to racism. When anyone who studied this and knows about this knows that it's the existence of racism that leads to the constitution of races. So racism makes races, not the other way around. In which case, what you can see is that, you can see this, for example, and there are many people on this audience who probably, have had experience of airport stories. I mean, this is a common thing about Muslims now. How to spot a Muslim? And you remember there are many kind of charlatans and trainers working out how to spot a Muslim. And these stories circulate. Unfortunately, many of them are true. If you say Allah Akbar, that could be a sign of radicalization or having a beard and all sorts of things. So there is a sense in which people can spot a Muslim. There is a racialization of Muslims through a variety of techniques and put there. So it's not to say that Muslims are a race, because there isn't really much to be said about the biological category of race, but to recognize that Muslims are racialized. And I think that the definition of Islamophobia doesn't do anything about sectarian disputes in Islam. And my feeling is always that Islamophobia doesn't do much about the definition of Islamophobia didn't do much about global warming either. It is a definition. It's not a magic spell that will cure all the ills of the world. It was simply to work on that. And there's some issues that it will deal with, and other issues are not necessarily going to be dealt with in that.
I wanted for our audience, I'm going to share with them the screen that shows the Islamophobia people's definition, which is something that you guys have developed. Do you want to talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, I think that the idea the idea of this infographic was to try and deal with the problem we often got from well-meaning audiences, but the Muslims are not a race. They come from different ethnic groups and from all over the world. So this is a kind of common definition of race in play, which basically reduces race to phenotype. And as it says, that Muslims are not a race, but they're treated as one. So you have it by name, by dress, by residency. So in nearly all parts of the global north and elsewhere, to be honest with you, you can tell what a Muslim is by using residencies. You can tell them about towns or neighborhoods. And what the infographic does is try and show that argument that you don't even have to be a Muslim to experience Islamophobia. And I think this is ask Mexicans, ask Sikhs. It doesn't translate into a kind of stable, biologically determined racial category, partly, and most importantly, because there's no such thing as biologically stable racial categories, but there is a process of racialization. And that is one of the main kind of epistemological impulses, as well as political impulses of organizing social life, that the racialization is the way that people think through social ontologies, how groups exist. So I think that the infographic was really basically, hoping that, people who are not specialist academics would be able to see the steps in that argument and see this is why we say Islamophobia equal racism.
Now, speaking about Islamophobia in the general, broader terms, what are the ongoing projects right now that you're having at Leeds, and what are the things that, at least in the cooking stage, while also maybe commenting on how do you see Islamophobia in the UK context, specifically with the new government, and what type of political discourses are occurring? And so if you want to also comment, do you see anything relative to COVID-19 and Islamophobia? How do we see that?
I think there are a couple of things here. Firstly, I think with the defeat of the Corbyn project in Britain, which is the space for Islamophobia has expanded. And I mean, not just in terms of people being more Islamophobic, but the counter challenges it, the ability to challenge Islamophobia is really expanded. That it's becoming very, very difficult for any public Muslim position to be articulated without it being subject to various kinds of attacks, etc. So that's the first issue that's going on there. I think, secondly, I would say in relation to COVID-19, I mean, there's a certain kind of suspicion that arises among communities who are often beleaguered. So, for example, in this country, some of the areas with the highest concentration of Muslim populations found out 3 hours before the beginning of Eid that they had to go into immediate lockdown. And people were saying that, well, Christmas Eve would not have been locked down in a way. Why did it take that long? They could have said earlier, so people had prepared their food, all the gatherings and all of these things here. So there's a certain way, and I mean, these are sort of petty examples, but there's also broader example in relation to the question of how anti-Semitism is being mobilized, a number of these sort of factors, and how that's being played off against Islamophobia in a sense that, so the logical position that one can have, that one can be both against anti-Semitism and against Islamophobia, gets lost in that possibility and they become contentious. So I think the work that we're doing in Leeds right now and really is still a kind of a development of trying to help that definition, or what I would prefer to call a people's understanding of Islamophobia, to spread wider and for it to become part of public debate. But also, I want Muslim school children and other school children, for example, to be able to point out Islamophobia when they see it in classrooms, when they see it in a day-to-day situation. They should be able to identify it, because it is through that identification and that calling out that both mobilizes people and educates people. And I think that's really, really important. And from my experience, in a sense, that there was a period, like I said before, that no one believed that there was racism. Even people of color didn't believe there was racism. I mean, that's how pernicious it became. To the point, now you have a situation that many, many people are able to call out racism in many, many cases. People who are not people of color will say, oh, this is racist. Now, so I think that is a tremendous shift. And I think so the work that we're doing right now is really kind of work of public engagement around that issue. And the final thing is I'm trying to look at the kind of the global institution of Islamophobia. And I think that's really, really important, because for too long, Islamophobia has been a kind of fixed on Muslim minorities in the global north. And in most cases, that means immigrant minorities, because older Muslim communities have never, are been separated from that. And I think what we're seeing now, you look at, what's happening in Modi's India, or in Xi's China, or in Burma, or, you can multiply these examples. I won't mention Palestine, it's an ongoing kind of thing like that, but you can see that Islamophobia is a global phenomenon, not only because they use the same kind of, or similar kind of lexicon, that there is it has a relational unity, that how Islamophobia in one place turns and translates into another place. So if you look at for example, the treatment of the Uyghurs, and you compare that to the treatment of the Kashmiris. If you look at the treatment of, you can put out these groups and you can see there's a family resemblance of the ways they're discussed and the ways they're dealt with. And I think this is one of the issues for me. So firstly, there's the issue of global Islamophobia. And the other thing is that, of course, the idea of Muslims who are Islamophobes as well. I mean, that's not a paradox, but it's worth actually also investigating, because you see the kind of effects of that consequently. So I think it's those two areas that I'm theoretically or conceptually working on, or working around, or like you said, trying to cook. Trying to get the ingredients at this point rather than even getting cooking.
Great. Maybe right now we shift to, which is connected to your field of work that you've been trying to develop, critical Muslim studies. And for many people, again, they still deal with regular Muslim studies or Islamic studies as a field. And the idea of critical Muslim studies, what does it mean? What are we engaged in with that concept? And if we could think about the theoretical framework of critical Muslim studies. So take us through that type of work that you're undertaking. And I know there's a conference in April, and I'll mention that later on.
Yeah. Okay, so the long and short of it is, it's, you know, in a way, I think we've all been doing critical Muslim studies for a long time, but we just didn't identify it. So that's one of the elements of it. And the reason is this: the two kind of starting point, or the two main points, I think, for critical Muslim studies, or and you know, coining that term and building up the journal with a kind of research agenda, really addresses those two provisions. Firstly was this, that if anyone who's critical or anyone who is dissatisfied with the way that the knowledge about Islam and Muslims is circulates, is produced. Anyone who's read Orientalism, Edward Said's critique, and you know, it's a fantastic and very powerful book, but as we know, it's part of a larger tradition, or other people worked in that field, and you know, in a way, Edward Said is a culmination of some of these processes rather than the kind of origination of them in a way, okay? But there's a puzzle at the end of Orientalism. Supposing you read the book, you're convinced by the argument, then what? What happens to you? What do you do afterwards? And I remember going to many kind of conferences and workshops, and you know, making these kind of interventions about the critique of Orientalist production of knowledge, and you'd get enthusiastic, well, sometimes enthusiastic, sometimes slightly bored people coming up to you list. And you don't really have an answer to that, because it's not that there is a body of literature out there that you can read which is not Orientalist. It's actually the reading that you have to do which makes it de-orientalizes, because the literature doesn't really exist in sufficient depth. So I think that was the first kind of thing. So it is kind of, what do you do if you take the critique of Orientalism seriously, and what does that really mean? Now in the 80s, there's a kind of a response, and to take it, all Orientalism, the critique of Orientalism means is you basically do the opposite of Orientalism. You know, so you don't look at text, you look at Muslims, and you don't worry about something called Islam, you just look at the local manifestations, etc. So there's just kind of what I call anti-Orientalism grew up. I don't think that's a particularly helpful way of understanding it. The second thing, and I think we'll turn on this, is that I guess one way of thinking about critical Muslim studies is really what happens if you meet, if decolonial thinking meets the Islamicate. Now, on the one hand, it should be quite straightforward, right? And you know, at Granada, we do this thing about 1492. We know that's the fall of, you know, the fall of the last independent Muslim polity in the Iberian Peninsula. And then we have a situation in which, you know, Columbus discovers the Americas, yeah? So in a way you could see it fits in. But the problem is this, and when we start getting to the problem, that to what extent there's a kind of Atlantocentrism in many of the conventional accounts. Mm-hmm. There is a problem in relation to, for example, how if you look at the work of Fanon as a kind of one of the, you know, one of the main critical and intellectual engines of much of decolonial thinking, but you think about Fanon's position to within the Islamicate. Mm-hmm. It's not easy, you know. There's a translation of many things into categories of traditional peasantry and a complete evacuation of the Islamicate from that. Mm-hmm. And then finally, and I think the most tellingly, is if the decolonial becomes a kind of focus on the dispossessed, what do you say about formations such as those organized around the sign of Islam, or organized around, let's say, for example, the Sinosphere? How do they fit into this kind of global history? There is no doubt that if you accept that the coloniality of power was a global imposition, it eventually, all of these formations were, were subject to colonial influences, and we can see that where we go. The issue is this, is not just when it happened, but on the terms when it happened. So I think the conversation or the engagement between decoloniality and the Islamicate has to be more rigorous and more sustained than simply that the Muslims are one in a long line of dispossessed populations. And the final point I would make in relation to that, there is a position that Muslims have, not for any particular intrinsic reason to do with Islam or to do with Europe or whatever, but it just happens to be the case that in a way the relationship between the Islamicate and what becomes Europe is very, very complicated in relation to the fact that there is a kind of sense in which you could argue that the Europe becomes in relation, in contrast with the Islamicate. And that power dynamics plays itself out in various ways. So for all of these reasons, it seems to me that there is need for a deeper engagement and conversation between the decolonial and the Islamicate. And the critical Muslim studies is something that houses that conversation. I mean, let me just explain very quickly what I mean by the Islamicate, because the Islamicate is a term Marshall Hodgson innovated, and I use it a lot. And it's a way to differentiate between the kind of unstructured use of Islam to the idea that, for example, I don't think there's much point in saying there's Islamic mathematics, but I think there's an Islamicate mathematics, because the Islamicate really refers to all kinds of social phenomena which are inspired by the Islam, but not necessarily reducible to Islam. So in a sense, it talks about a complex cultural formation that appeared, which is not subject to being something. So you don't get into this category of religion, et cetera, et cetera. You say, actually, there's an Islamicate expression around, for example, dress, or other kinds of attributes and things like that. So the way that we build mosques, there's a kind of family resemblance in particular regional styles of mosque building. They're not Islamic in the sense that it is canonically the way you can only build a mosque with this shape. They emerge in different contexts, but they become Islamicate. So if you are, in Timbuktu, or you're in Bangladesh, or you're in Indonesia, you can recognize a mosque because of the particular style it has. But also, if you're not from those regions, you can recognize a mosque. But you wouldn't say that this is the authentic mosque, and this is, or we shouldn't say, and this is just a deviation. Though I'm sure there'll be people who'll be willing to talk about the deviation of architectural forms.
So let me pick some of the strands that you address for critical Muslim study. One, you touched on dating between 1492 and is 1492 the date of demarcation for looking at critical Muslim studies? Is it earlier? Is it the Mongol invasions crisis, or is it the rise of the Ottomans? And these are conversations that we always have. How do we date it? And also how to locate Islamic history or Islamicate history within world history, because it seems to be there's constant delineation almost where Islamic history is also looking internally only and not in engagement or constant relationship, both in terms of scholarship as well as it unfolds. So can you maybe speak to this question of dating and how to date the critical Muslim studies, and what are we trying to introduce?
Well, this is quite an interesting question, Hatem. And I think you remember one of the symposiums we had in Granada was really about this. Because if you look at Orientalism, the Edward Said very carefully dates or the beginning of Orientalism as a epistemological project tied into the kind of imperial expansion of Europe to the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt. And what is really remarkable about that invasion is not that Napoleon arrived with soldiers, but he also arrived with philosophers, linguists, major thinkers of this time. And, and so the plundering of Egypt wasn't just for a treasure, but also for artifact and knowledge, etc. So, now you would say 1797 and 1492, what difference does 300 years make? Yeah, among friends. And I think there is a number of possibilities within that point, right? One is this, that if 1492, but almost 40 years before that, you have 1453, where Constantinople is captured and becomes the capital of the Ottoman state. So in a way, it's very difficult to see this as a complete story of decline. One of the main drivers for the in the Iberian Peninsula for the eventual expulsion of Muslims and Jews was the fear among the Iberian authorities that a Muslim army will come from Africa and retake what had been lost. So there's a whole fear of the fifth column. Now, again, that shows you very different power dynamics. So the question then is really, what are we trying to measure and what are we trying to account for? And that, I think, fits into the idea of a world history. In the kind of classical formation of Muslim world history, the role of Muslims is simply to, as I've said many times, to act as postal workers, that they take the heritage of the classics, hand it to the Renaissance, and go back to sleep again, and that's it, right? So you can work against that and say, actually, well, no, there's more complicated and da-da-da-da. But there is a sense of the notion of decline, a weakness. And my kind of feeling is this, that well, perhaps that decline and weakness is quite overstated. As part of it is also the idea of the rise of the West. And all social sciences and humanities are really, in the Western episteme, are really attempts to both sustain the exceptionality of the West, the rise of the West, and to maintain the border between the West and the non-West. And you can see this in various kind of permutations and things like that. But the consequence of that is that there is a history which is kind of lost, not in a sense that it's been completely destroyed, etc., or doesn't exist in books. I mean, that's part of it. But it's been lost in the way that it doesn't inform Muslim consciousness or public discourse in the same way. And that becomes part of the kind of colonization, what people often describe as colonization of the mind. So in a sense, history doesn't exist as a public format in the same. And that then makes it difficult for us to imagine Muslims to imagine themselves into the future, because it becomes a story which simply ends. And therefore you are now at the end. So in a sense, Muslims are living at the end of history, but in a very different way, not because everyone has become Muslim or like, the Fukuyama's thing, we live at the end of history because everyone's become a liberal Democrat, but rather history is end because you no longer are able to write history. You're not able to write the future. That ultimately underpins and makes it impossible to think about political autonomy and any kind of autonomy. So for me, the debate around the beginnings, whether it's the Mughals or the Ottomans or whatever, is really tipped over, and that often depends on what we think can be done about restoring a more balanced global order. And that, it seems to me, is not easily resolvable if you take a very long view. If you start off with the assumption that the Muslim world came to an end for all intents and purposes in 1258, you can't explain a very simple fact right now. There are more Muslims on the planet right now than there've ever been. And this is not just a demographic because there are more people, but it's also in terms of, you know, as a percentage, for example. It means something. And I think it's important for us to bear that in mind. So I would say to you, one of the most important tasks, and we've talked about it, is to be able to write this different kind of world history in which you can tell a consistent story about the, you know, how the Islamicate unfolds. And I think it's really important. One of the pleas that I, you know, one of the reasons, I suppose, for critical Muslim studies is this, that despite what you may hear, I think Muslims in general are quite well informed about their canonical history, or they're about the more or less understand the history and the more or less understand their faith. You know, they have an understanding of that. But if I asked even amongst this audience, you know, to name Muslim figures which are not canonical figures, which are not part of the Prophet's entourage, I think we'd run out very, very quickly. And the problem is that then we don't have a resource to learn from those who came, you know, who didn't have the benefit of the direct prophetic intervention, but still faced tremendous challenges. So we cannot explain many things. And I think that becomes a problem, you know, and we tend to exceptionalize the current crisis and not have a way of thinking through some of those issues, and see these kind of contingent humans who were steadfast in their faith, as you know, and what I mean by steadfast, I mean not because they were more or less, you know, it varies like everyone else, but we're trying to do something, and sometimes they succeeded and sometimes they failed. Without that, we don't have anything. We only have a story of a kind of a failure and continual failure, and I think that's really problematic.
Well, let me add another question, and you could take it. There's some within the Muslim ranks that see that using the term critical is an attempt to undo Islam itself. Again, thinking of the whole critical theory and now applying it to Islam. So is this a project of really undermining Islam by means of this critical theory application to Islamic studies? Again, I'm speaking through.
Sure. Now, I mean, you hear that criticism, but you only hear that criticism from people who either don't know what critical theory is, who certainly don't know what critical Muslim studies is. But to be fair to them, one of the issues is this, that there has been a proliferation recently of people saying they're doing critical Muslim studies. It's just, and I think some of them do think what they're doing is critical Muslim studies, partly for that reason. Others have no idea, but they think it's probably a good idea to put critical in front of it because it makes it look whatever. I think the real difference is that the point of critical Muslim studies is really not at all intended to undermine, or I don't think it's a possibility, to be honest with you, but to have confidence in being able to tell and understand the way the Islamicate operates within the horizon of the world today. So I don't see that. I don't think there's anything in my work that points to that. I mean, you know, so
it's coming from basically people just out of fear and not wanting that which they feel so protected. They don't want to even pose the question.
Okay,
that
but
might
I think
create some level of, you know, challenge.
I think the thing about critical here is this, and in the opening, in the first issue of Reorient, we actually did my co-authors, we actually did talk about this. Critical here means a critique of the present, to recognize that the present has a history. It's not an objective fact. That's where the critical is. Critical here doesn't mean in that sort of petty sense of being critique. And I think it's, look, you don't need to do critical Muslim studies to criticize Islam. You can just do Islamic studies. I mean, that's the whole inheritance of Islamic studies has been, I would argue, exactly that. So I think, for those reasons, I would be, I hear that, I don't see it.
Yeah. Well, Roberto from San Diego, our beloved friend, he's saying, as Angela Davis once said, let us remember that the mere invocation of the word critical does not in itself ensure criticality.
Exactly.
So,
no, that's absolutely the case. And I think this is the problem. In a way, it's a problem, but it's also it also points to a recognition of a need. You have to ask, well, why is it that so many people want that? What is it that critical actually does? Even if they're not they don't want to, express criticality. What is it the work the critical does? And I do think that part of it is that critical offers a escape route from the present. And I think if we want to imagine and construct a better world, we cannot surrender to the present. And that's
what part of the conversation is that the past 200 plus years of what we call contemporary Muslim history really has to be re-examined because it really emerged as a way to give standing for the post-colonial national project built upon a colonial Eurocentric distortion. So we're still, even in the past 200 years, how we approach the Islamic history in its various contexts really have to be reshaped and re-examined. And that itself is an intellectual project that needs to be delved into.
Absolutely. And I think part of the critical Muslim study is really try to fashion out what tools we have for doing that. I made the point that Muslims didn't have Islamic studies. And I meant that not just frivolously. It's simply Muslim scholars before the colonial kind of engulfment studied the world. They didn't have to label it in that way. It subsequently becomes Islamic studies. And there's a problem about Muslim autonomy in the kind of framing of Islamic studies and others. So I think it is really important that we don't forget that the concepts that we use, it's not a question of just recovering a history. It's also a conceptual work that has to be done here at them. And I think this is where the critical, because there are too many things. Okay, this is a kind of thing that I'm working on right now. And it's the notion of how we understand Orientalism. So it's inshallah in the forthcoming book. This is an argument that I'm making there, but I'll just mention it here. If you think about Orientalism only in terms of writing about Muslims and other and non-Europeans, you forget that actually what Orientalism does is enable the construction of the Western episteme. In that sense that, it is what allows. So when we, for example, if you go to a sociology textbook and you think about family, what is the idea of a family in contrast to? Which families is this in contrasting to? So everything, and it's not just a normative element. There's actually a conceptual element that Orientalism, which has often been neglected as simply being the kind of concern of a very narrow range, whether it's the Middle East or, again, problematic terms, how our vocabulary trips over in these things, or East Asia or whatever. It is considered to be those things, rather than seeing that the idea of the Orient is what haunts the West. And it is in that haunting that makes it possible for Western knowledge to be produced. So when you think like that, what happens to the understanding of what you can do when you try, and let's say if you wanted to have an emancipatory project, not just about the Islamic case, but let's say anything outside the frontier of non-Europeanness, let's say there, right? Outside the pale of Europe, so you have to be very, very attentive that you're not being recuperated into a certain sensibility, which is simply a European sensibility played out. And I'll give you a very brief example of that. Nearly, if you look at, for example, the critique of empire and the use of empire, there is now in our kind of collective hegemonic imagination, all empires are basically the European colonial empires. We have no way of imagining different kinds of imperial configurations. So we suddenly impose those categories on them. Now that may or may not be valid, but you can't do that by simply reading or translating that experience and saying that that is what an empire is, because then you can't explain many, many other things. There's a very good example of that. You often hear around the Ottoman Empire being another colonial empire. Now, when the Ottoman Empire in 1909 had a parliament, there was a debate what areas of the Ottoman Empire should be considered a colony. So one argument, should Yemen have the same kind of representative rights as Anatolia? And they said yes. So there was no kind of institutionalized. Now, if you went in France or Britain, Indonesia was never given the same right to vote in the Dutch Parliament. And, you know, so I think it's problematic to just read through that experience. And that's, I think, a question about critical Muslim studies is about forging concepts rather than simply applying them.
Maybe I wanted to get your comment. You know the book, The Idea of the Muslim World. And we tend to have these conversations that people engage that this concept of the Muslim world is actually a modern invention rather than the concept of ummah has been in existence. How it gets to be articulated differs through one period or the other. What's your view on that?
One of the arguments in that book is to demonstrate that there was no sense of the Muslim world. And one of the examples used is that in the early 19th century, a Muslim ruler in South India called Tipu Sultan writes to the Ottoman Caliph in Istanbul asking for assistance. The Ottomans refuse because while Tipu Sultan is fighting the British in India, the Ottomans need the British to fight the French in Europe. And the argument is made, well, look, it just shows, and I think this is, you know, the argument, it shows that there was no Muslim unity. And this is something that I think misses 2 points. One, and I've talked to Jamal, you know, about this, is that in one sense, what I find interesting, why did Tipu Sultan write all the way to Istanbul? Why? That shows a certain, he didn't write to the Tsar. He could have written to you know, anyone else. So there's some kind of expectation or exchange. Secondly, the question is this: what would you have done if you were, you know, if you were the Ottomans? So you have the Napoleonic invasion, which is still occupying part of your territory, and you don't know where it's going to finish or end. So you're too weak on yourself to defend it without alliance, and the alliance that you have is a British one. Similarly, if you're Tipu Sultan, what are you doing? It's the British that you're fighting. So it seems to me that, you know, I don't see how different it could be, but I don't see that as a kind of a abandonment of the idea of some kind of ummatic unity or ummatic sensibility, if you want to put it like that, or Islamosphere, because it's the contrary, it actually exists. There was expectation on that. And it was an expectation at a very basic level without the infrastructural support to allow that to happen.
But also the idea of thinking that being a one community or a community, that you actually don't have contradictions or differences or political rivalries,
Yeah.
At a certain point, you have actually three contestants to the Islamic Caliphate at a certain point. So even the assumption of what negates this concept of a Muslim Ummah or Muslim world actually almost creates an idealistic, non-existent concept of what it means. While let's say thinking about, let's say, Europe, where you have so much contradiction, but you still have a European Union with rivalries in it, but speaking about the Muslim world, you actually almost don't allow for that.
No, I think it's a really, really important point, Hatem, and I want to reinforce that with two examples. If you read a lot of these books on, for example, the contemporary, sort of the Muslim thinkers like Maududi, Khomeini, Qutb, etc., and you'll often have the conclusion will come after reading a chapter. One of the problems is that none of these people agreed with each other, therefore there cannot be any kind of Islamicist thought, right? Now, when you go and read a book like, I don't know, if you read Marx or Gramsci or Mao or Lenin, no one suddenly turns around and say there's no Marxist thought because they contradict with each other. So that's one thing at a competitive level, that why do you demand from the Ummah not unity but uniformity?
Mm.
And the other example is the European Union one. Between 1871 to 1945, Germany and France went to war a number of times. As a result, something like 70 million people died.
Mm.
1 million, over a million French people were killed. 1 million Germans were killed, right? Less than 10 years later, they formed the Treaty of Rome, which lays the foundation for the European Union. Now, if you look at the history, if you compare that, people often talk, and you can see this, the hostility towards between the Ottomans and the Safavids, and you don't really have an analog of the same kind of treachery. This is from 1871 to 45, within 70 years. The frontier between what is now Iran and Turkey has been constant for about 300 years.
Mm.
And you can make those examples, and you could pick other places. And this is what I mean by reading from European history and then expecting everything else to fall into shape falls us into thinking, well, these things must be the same everywhere.
Well, methodologically, that we often are trying to read Islamic history through European methodology, which creates so many problems, contradictions in the approach even.
I think I would say, I agree with you, but I would phrase it like through Eurocentric methodologies.
Okay.
Because I think it's not the European-ness of it. It is any methodology which unproblematically places Europe at the heart. And what I mean by unproblematically, there may be good reasons for saying actually what happened in Europe should be at the heart, because that's the way you can tell the story. But you need to at least have that conversation. Is this the case, or we just assume it to be the case? And I think the other thing about talking about it as Eurocentric rather than European is that you and I know many, many people of color, many people non-Europeans, who are some of the best Eurocentric thinkers and historians and cheerleaders. So I think we have to understand Europe as a project rather than just a geography or even a kind of a culture.
Now, one of the questions, which let me maybe rephrase it, and the discussion of critical Muslim studies is predominantly taking place in the global north. Even work on Islamophobia is predominantly in the global north. And how do we really create both a dialogue of north-south from scholars that work in this field, but more importantly, a south-south dialogue and scholarship and critical engagements outside of the scope of the global north?
I think this is a really important task, and it's a difficult one. One of the problems is this, and I think it's been made by Ramon quite often, and I think it just stands to reason. There are hardly any universities on the planet which are not centered on a kind of Western episteme. So the first issue is this, that these issues of criticality don't even penetrate the global south, often because the infrastructure of knowledge production is still located and replays a colonial kind of model there. So that's the first element there. And often there is more importance. So for example, with university administrators in the global south, it's more important for them to have their universities moving up on the international league tables, on following metrics which privilege particular types of knowledge rather than other kinds of knowledge. So the idea of the university or the academic spaces as being the kind of laboratories for emancipatory thinking or imagination, or that I think has been lost for many, many reasons. And often in the global south, there's also the issue, well, that's just the global south, everywhere, there is an issue that we have to deal with. Conversations or thinking about the Islamicate invites a certain degree of state intervention. So the state is not neutral in these anywhere. So those are the kind of constraints and challenges. Having said that, I think all we can do and what we should be trying to do is try and build parallel networks. I think one of the things that, critical Muslim studies is a multi sort of platform project in a way, that you have an academic journal, you have blogs, you have podcasts. And the idea really is to try and mobilize people into that, opening into that, to writing into that, to doing work around that. And it seems to me that is really, really important, that we do build these kind of insights, and we move away from simply a kind of a model which reproduces the colonial relationship, that you have northern production and the southern consumption, to make it a dialogue. And to make it a dialogue requires us to be able to think very carefully about the colonial inheritance, which subjugates that kind of production of knowledge. So I think it is a challenge. But I think everything that you do, and I think in a small way that we're trying to do, is really an attempt to try and to recognize that and see what can be done given those kind of institutional constraints.
Well, the scope of really trying to do scholarship research in the global south, just as it's possibly increasingly in the global north, the space of doing that is narrowing to almost an extreme level. And then more importantly, I just in my conversation with Ramon just last week, that there isn't a place in the global south in relations to the Muslim world that actually deals with critical Muslim thought, decoloniality. You don't have a single center that actually is focused on studying and delving into the colonial and post-colonial and decolonial understanding. So that also leaves a whole terrain just to cover within the Muslim world and also within sections in the global south.
I mean, absolutely. And I think the challenge is really, I guess there's two issues here. One is that there's a kind of almost a kind of epistemological insurgency, that you kind of have to make these kinds of moves which are outside the kind of normal infrastructures for the production of knowledge, which means a lot of hard work. And I think this is one of the things that it does require a lot more labor. You don't have that kind of backup there. But I think also if you look at the experience, let's say, the civil rights experience in the United States becomes a template for populations in many parts of the world, because the logic of racism, which is kind of internalized colonialism, is being reproduced in many parts of the world. So in a sense, you have a certain ability to learn from that resistance. So one of the things is this, that how did African-American knowledge production take place in the era of Jim Crow? When, for example, enslaved African-Americans and enslaved Muslims, I mean, let's also forget, were forbidden to read, were forbidden to have any kind of associative meaningful contacts which would allow for that. And then you still see the kind of constraints and cracks and building up those networks at building up those kind of enforcements. I think the thing to remember is that, you know, the Muslim Ummah is very large. The dispossessed of the world is very large. The global South is very large. So there is a sense in which there is a huge resource to put there. And one of the ironic things in the UK has been that in life, you know, the kind of sadistic murder of George Floyd, what you've had is organizations going over backwards, condemning police brutality to demonstrate their anti-racism, but perhaps being less aware of their own practices, which perpetuate a particular type of racial exclusionary logic around their discipline, around the production of knowledge. So I think these are the sort of challenges that we have to embrace. And I think the only way to do that is by doing the work. I think one of the things about it, and I said this, you know, critical Muslim studies, if we all start thinking about ourselves in that rather than Islamic studies disappears. I mean, you know, in the end, astrology disappeared as a serious discipline. So I think there is an issue as well that, you know, it is something that we need to be able to say that we need to produce a different kind of knowledge that steps outside the kind of Eurocentric gaze. And by doing that, it produces better outcomes. I mean, that's the other thing. And if you have the conviction to do that, then I think that makes a huge difference.
For the last section of our discussion, I wanted to move to your book, Recalling the Caliphate. And really, what's your thesis? Because it have resonated with a large number of individuals that are looking at the Muslim world. So what was your thesis, and how to build upon it for individuals that are reading it as we begin a new semester in different parts of the world?
I think I was trying to do three different things. One of them, the book itself calls itself quite clearly as an exercise in critical Muslim studies. So it's very conscious of that. And that leads to its structure, which is basically twofold. It's sort of, there are sections in it which is really, which I divide into what I call clearing and dreaming. And one of the things about clearing is this, that any person of color, before you can have the conversation about what the dreams will be, what would be better, you have to spend a lot of time clearing the ground, clearing away the assumptions that Eurocentric knowledge has produced about particular cases, right? So it's, you know, getting rid of some of the anthropological baggage in some cases, getting rid of all of those sorts of things. So that's the first part, is really to see that kind of move between clearing and then to the dreaming part. And what that meant in the book is organized in a series of single word chapters, for example, relativism or democracy. And that was for me a recognition that every time you talked about Muslim political agency, these were the type of questions that would be thrown in your way before to have that conversation. So part of it is dealing with those questions. The second part of the book is really to reflect upon what does the Caliphate mean. And one of the disappointments that many people have, this is not a book about the Caliphate as a particular objective institution. It's really a book about what does the Caliphate mean, the significance it has, why this institute after 80 years. And again, if you look at the books written, you know, before the recent events, they would say, well, this is an ancient institution. Why is it, you know, why would people worry about it? What does it resonate? What does it represent? And I think one of the things that the Caliphate represented, if you think about it, is the idea of Muslims being able to write themselves as agents of world history. In other words, the Caliphate represents a great power, a Muslim great power. And I think that then opens up a different kind of horizon. So you're actually thinking about the linkages between expressions of Muslim sovereignty, which then undergird Muslim autonomy. And what that then does is underwrite a pluralization of the world. Now, it's an interesting experience that one of the great historians of the, a very traditional historian of the Iberian Peninsula wrote, talking about the fall of Granada. And he writes that, you know, after Granada fell, within a few years, the Muslims found themselves expelled, marginalized, etc., and subject to some forms of ethnic cleansing. And he says that what was the role of Granada and other Muslim states was to make sure, keep the Catholic powers honest, to make sure they kept to their treaties. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, there's an argument, and he's writing this, and it was happening at the time of the Bosnian Civil War, that the loss of political power actually is felt individually. And you can imagine different kinds of counterfactuals. It's hard for me to imagine, and I may be wrong about this, that if the Ottoman state had existed past 1919, let's say, I think the fate of the Palestinians would be very, very different. Mm-hmm. You know, then the next question comes in, well, how can we, surely it doesn't really matter, because how can we guarantee the ethical behavior, or how can we guarantee that Muslims behave Islamically? And I don't believe that we can guarantee that, but we can guarantee that they behave, they identify themselves as Muslims, and what that then opens up another kind of contestation, what that means. And the things, so I think a lot of the problems that the Muslims, you know, the Muslim Ummah faces, and I think also the Global South faces, is really a problem that comes from not defective culture or epistemology. These are political problems, not cultural problems. And I think that's really, really important to recognize that. And I think, so the second sort of main strand within that, recalling the Caliphate, is to recognize the primacy of the political, which often gets missed out. And then the third and final strand, I suppose, is a kind of a checking of not allowing a kind of anti-political understanding of the decolonial to take over, which I think is simply problematic, because in the end, what you're talking about is not a world without power. You're talking about different configurations of power. And I think there's a huge difference between the two things. And I think people become very queasy about saying the latter. And they want to imagine the former. But the success of the former has, I find very, very difficult to see that anywhere.
Well, maybe I could interject with the question as well. Is the contemporary period of imagining and thinking of Islam as apolitical and insisting that there is this notion of that Islam cannot be in the political, which is being at least argued or being pushed, especially in the past 20 plus years.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely, one of the problems is this, and I know that in the American context, this may have a slightly different connotation. So let me say this provocatively, but then let me be clear, this is a provocation rather than a thought there. One of the things that I say in recording the Caliphate is that Islam is not a religion. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to join the Republican parts of the Republican Party and go along with them trying to...
They're looking for more memberships.
Yes, as you know, I'm already a member. But the reason I say this, and I describe Islam as a language, And the reason why I wanted to do this is that we tend to forget, and this goes back to the thing about the critical, we treat religion as an objective concept. And I don't mean objective as partial, but it's something that's just normal. Now, if you look at, for example, the first English translation of the Quran in the 16th century, 16th, 15th, 17th century, where you find in contemporary translations the word religion, you find the word law. Because the first translations of the Quran took place before the concept of religion had the meaning it does now. Now, when you think about Islam as law, and then you think about, for example, Hinduism, which also thinks of itself in that way, there's no Hinduism as a religion, or Judaism, you see that they have a much closer family affinity as to being nomos, custom, law, etc. Islam doesn't call itself religion. Now, I'm sure someone will turn around and say to me, but deen means religion. No, it's the concept of religion that deen gets translated into, when early Muslims would not have understood deen means religion because there was no category of religion. Now, that's not just an academic point, but the point is this, that once you think about the concept of religion, the concept of religion is one of the most pernicious concepts which emerges after Western Christianity, because it's an Enlightenment understanding of, or projection of, a particular Christian history onto the world. And by that token, everything else is either defective religion or non-religious. So you can see that with the experience of Judaism or Sikhism or Hinduism or Native American customs. All of these things cannot be religion. And that religion has a category where you make a distinction in the Enlightenment reading of it between what is politics and what is not. This is so kind of strange to most human experience that it's like importing a problem and then working out why you can't sort it, because it's not a problem that exists by itself. So I think the point that I would make on this is that it is that understanding which depoliticizes Islam, because one of the most challenging things I think for Muslims right now has been the attempt to, what I would say, Christianize Islam. That many kind of attributes of what a religion is. There are many in the Muslim communities who say, right, to make Islam respectable, we have to make it more religious, make it more religious-like. And to make it more religious-like means following the template of Western Christianity, or its understanding of itself. So there's some issues, like, for example, the issue around Darwinism. It actually makes no sense through the kind of literally reading the Quran. It's not the same kind of book. It's not something to worry, it's not an issue. But it becomes now, you can't go to any Muslim bookshop without having a book about Darwinism. It's the problem that's not arisen there. And you can multiply these examples. And at the end of it, what happens is that the field of Islam is only a normative one. It's always outside. It's a private sphere. It isn't about building a social order. There's in the book, I discussed this wonderful passage with, well, I think it's wonderful, not that I discuss it wonderfully necessarily, but I discussed this passage where Muhammad Iqbal quotes a Muslim Sufi saying that, Muhammad of Arabia ascended the highest heaven and returned. By God, if it had been me, I would never have come back. And what he talks about here is the difference between the mystic and the prophetic. And the prophetic, and I would say that Islam begins when the prophet returns. And the prophet returns to transform society, transform social relations. There was no need for him to return in that sense if he wasn't the prophet. And I think that's what gets lost. That the point, if you think about Islam as a religion, then you will have to put it in the straitjacket, which it will continually fold against, and you will not be able to make sense of the world. And this is both an epistemological problem, a cultural problem, but ultimately a political problem.
And maybe I could at least extend it a little bit more. You're familiar with Charles Bernard's book, Writing for the Civil Democratic Islam, and attempting to forge a new type of Islamic identity by pitting various trends, sects, groupings of Islam against one another. With, again, an understanding of trying to produce and bring forth a particular type of Muslim that accepts their inferiority, their dispossession, their political lack of agency as the acceptable norm and build upon it. And what I want to extend this conversation, that 1979 is an important point of demarcation for you in terms of your work. So can you possibly maybe touch on the civil democratic Islam, but actually think of it in a larger array from 79, which is almost 41 years of thinking of the contemporary period that we're still experiencing?
The book is called Recalling the Caliphate because its kickoff point is the abolition, suspension of the Caliphate in 1924. And the argument that is made is that if the Caliphate, by abolishing the Caliphate, what you do, you actually throw up a question that never really existed in the same way for Muslims previously, a historical question, a strong question. How should Muslims live? Now, prior to that, the answer was very simple. You should live under a Muslim government exemplified by the Caliphate. So you could have, this is not the right person. And if you look at the Shia Sunni split, it is really about who should be Caliph, not that there should be the institution of Caliph or not. I mean, that's the reasonable point. And you can multiply that. This is the wrong person, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, what is a legitimate government is that. Once you abolish the Caliphate, you suddenly have a question now of how should Muslims live? Now, as I put that question down, that in 1947, there is a kind of a partial answer to that, because in that answer, it is impossible to imagine a country like the formation of Pakistan, which simply says that actually Muslims constitute a political subjectivity. So they should have a state, a nation state of their own. Now that's quite a big break, but that doesn't really go very much further because there's no thinking through and no decolonization of that founding moment. So between, in 47 to 53, I think that project is finished. It becomes just another nation state, but still haunted by that kind of sense of wanting to be and needing to be more than just a nation state written large. Then I think 79 comes along, and I think it comes in that durée. So that idea then becomes that, okay, so what do you do if you don't have the right caliph? You need an Islamic government. And it's an attempt to actually fill that vacuum with the kind of idea of the right government. And I would argue that the concept of Vilayat al-Faqih could be seen as a kind of one way of understanding the caliphate. So in that trajectory, you actually have the politicization of Muslimness, that Muslims constitute not just a religious community or a cultural community, but they actually constitute a political community, a political agency. Now, subsequent to that, and there was various attempts to try and harness and depoliticize that energy into various schemes. Some of them, I would say, some smack of a certain form of liberalism. And what I mean by liberalism here isn't something which is a philosophical liberalism, which by definition, I think is anti-political. So part of the civil democratic projects, and it's not the only one, there are many ways of articulating it, is to take away the possibility of actually recognizing the recognition of conflict, the idea of finding basically a denominator around agreement on principle, but that agreement is based on things which are already in play. It is an attempt to have an Islam which is kind of domesticated. And I think that domestication is a denial of agency and a denial of its decolonial potential. So the decolonial potential of Islam is not just for Muslims. I think it's global because of the way that Muslims constitute such a large part of the world, the large expanse in a way. There are possibilities which exist in a kind of decolonization there, which could have a more balanced world, I think.
Now, extending to the current configuration in the region, and then maybe push you into the contemporary, most recent development. Most likely you were aware of the United Arab Emirates, Israel deal. I don't put peace, it's a deal, but it's in the background of creating a regional alliance to restoke another Shia-Sunni regional confrontations. How do you view this new, most recent development, and what can we take out from it as we push back broadly, both in terms of academic, but also in our circles of influence and discussion?
I think the first thing we can do is recognize that there is a conflict throughout the Islamosphere, but the contours of that conflict are not exhausted by sectarianism. It's not really a conflict between Shia and Sunni or Arab, non-Arab. The real conflict, I would argue, is between absolutism and accountability. And if you recognize the political nature of that conflict, if you recognize that's what the conflict is about, then the possibilities completely change. And what I mean by absolutists are basically, if you look at the people in alliance throughout the Muslim world, there are those who have very little sense of accountability except to themselves. Whether they are Republican or monarchical, it doesn't really matter. Arrayed against them in a perhaps not as systematic way are those projects which, however problematic, however troubling, and this is not to absolve them of all of these things, at the same time they have a sense of accountability. And I want to put it stronger than that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's complete or it's satisfactory or whatever. It's not a conflict between demons and angels. It's a conflict between demons and humans. And I think in that configuration, it is really, really important to recognize what politics is about. In my work, I make a lot of the distinction between the political and politics. So the political exists when there's a conflict and you take up sides. Politics is a way of trying to manage that within certain contexts, but at the same time, recognizing that it is not always manageable. So right now, the main configuration that I see, in these various kinds of alliances is a much more concentrated alliance. And I think one of the issues is this, that it's a kind of a last throw of the dice for as I can see, for the old absolutist order. If you put this in the longer trajectory, you start off by having, after the Ottomans, you basically have the region to be dominated by extra-regional powers, which were, to be supported by, let's say, the United States, etc. So Iran under the Shah was one example of that. Turkey was another example of that. You have these as a way of controlling that. With the Iranian Revolution, you suddenly have the United States having to be more involved in the region. I think that becomes quite clear, but I think the fiasco and the murderous fiasco of Iraq limits that possibility, in Afghanistan as well limits that possibility. And now you are kind of really left on that. And I think what the challenge right now among opinion makers is really to kind of advocate and to think how to articulate accountability, how to articulate access of accountables in a way, and to develop that as a way of seeing, both seeing the conflict and challenging what's happening there. For me, that's the only, I don't know whether you would agree with that, or where you know, what your analysis would be.
Well, I agree in terms of the absolutist versus accountability, transformative political change to occur. I think the moment of people mobilizing during the Arab Spring was an opening that people wanted to really come out from under the heavy boot of post-colonial absolutist monarchies or Republican rule. And that has been pushed back to another cluster of absolutist political discourses. And now you have Israel and the United States actually coming to reconstitute a new regional configuration. And that's why I said it's not a peace treaty, it's an alliance agreement.
Yeah,
and there's a distinction that has to be made, that Israel is entering into an alliance agreement with United Arab Emirates. They definitely are having Egypt on their side with it, Saudi Arabia. They're trying to push Bahrain and Oman into the circle. There were an attempt to try to play a background work with Sudan to see if the new military council that is there might actually be pushed. So that alliance is really setting up the stage for another conflict, a protracted conflict in the region. The front lines of it, again, will be mass loss of people and another generation being sacrificed for a regional global power game being played.
So the only thing I don't disagree with you, Hatem. I think the challenge is really is that while the coordination among the kind of absolutist alliance is far stronger, I think the problem is that those who are confronted by the absolutists for a variety of reasons, I'm not sure that they have been able to find a way of converging their interests as well. I know there have been some sort of attempts, if you remember, in the early 2000s, there was the idea of the D8, which never really took off. There's the kind of the Kuala Lumpur summit and the Porto. I mean, these are kind of configurations of these going on there. And I think that also plays into the question about Islamophobia as well. One of the problems is this, that there's no kind of recognition about the danger that Islamophobia poses, even to those regimes themselves. So, I mean, there is a kind of a verbal rhetorical exercise, but not thinking through that as a phenomenon. And I think that is one of the issues that we need to be thinking about, that understanding Islamophobia is not something that just happens on the street, but also happens geopolitically.
Well, actually, maybe I could touch on, because I know that we have a number of audience that...
Well, I'm happy to open it up to some. So I would rather open it up to questions.
I wanted actually, we have a number of people from India, and since both of us at least continue to engage in both observing as well as working on aspects of India and Islamophobia with the PGP and the Modi, the Hindutva situation in Kashmir, maybe just how do you see the situation in India in also thinking Islamophobia in a global context?
Well, I would say to you that you are in a situation in India, and I'm not just talking about Kashmir now, where you have the installation of Jim Crow. And I use the word Jim Crow advisedly. I know this may annoy some Afro-pessimists, but the reason why I use it is that the United States maintained a veneer that it was a democratic society, but at the same time it subjugated African Americans, so its democratic status was not deterred by that. India makes much play, as does Israel, of their democratic status. But you have a systematic drive. Now, you know that what's going on there is the idea that, you know, the all Muslims should not really be in India, either they become, I mean, there's this kind of chatter exists. To some extent, it remains within some check because there is a viable, more or less viable Pakistan. If Pakistan was to become weaker, and weaker not just internally in terms of class, but weaker in terms of its commitments and its understanding, I could imagine, you know, the kind of conversations around expulsions and things like that becoming stronger and stronger. What is driving this is not just an anti-Muslim thing which is there, but it's also something which is against a particular kind of configuration of Indian society. Similarly, you know, why do you think the Chinese are so focused, not initially on the Uyghurs, but now on Muslims? Now, part of it, I think, about Islamophobia is that Islamophobia is a kind of a regulation of Muslimness as a way of projecting your Western trajectory. One of the ways you can be Western is by being anti-Muslim or developed, if you don't want to use Western. Because if you look at all of these narratives, the idea is that the Muslim is the primitive, it's the one that is preventing the state developing, etc. In India, for example, there was a huge thing that the COVID-19 India outbreak was caused by Muslims. I mean, these are classic kind of tropes being mobilized around that. And the consequence of these, I mean, you know, we only learned to our own, you know, jargon about the Rohingya when they were being basically virtually, you know, genocide was being committed against them. We didn't know, or didn't know enough about you know, since 1948, the kind of restrictions that they've had to face, and progressively. So I think what we're dealing with is you know, some people talk as a kind of the consequence of Islamophobia is a global Palestinianization, which is not just in terms of, you know, like I said before, the kind of linkages and exchanges of information and templates, etc. That goes on all the time. But that is one of the consequences of that. And it seems to me that that is playing a geopolitical factor now. It's not simply a matter of internal affairs. It actually has a geopolitical consequence. And it risks a lot. So you can go many places in the world who would say things like, you know, they're against, they will make conferences against Islamophobia, but they do not recognize that Islamophobia is not just a Western phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. You know, you know, I've seen and commented upon, for example, the greeting that Modi got in Iran. You know, it's extraordinary. And I think part of it is, and the final point I want to make, I suppose, is that one of the things the Caliphate tries to do, recording the Caliphate, the two types of, there's a kind of methodological individualism, which I think the critical tries to suppress, because in a way that you can understand things without any sense of structure or institution. But there's also a methodological nationalism, which haunts the Western episteme, which doesn't allow us to think relationally. So, and one of the things is that nearly all the kind of decision makers and the bureaucratic staff of most, you know, Muslim societies and societies in the global north are trained through that process, in which means there may be men and women of good conscience, but they often don't have the cognitive horizons to see beyond a very kind of narrowly conceived realpolitik. One of the ironies of the day is this, that you have the global south separated into nation states, but the apex of global power is not a nation state. I mean, this is the argument that's made, that the United States is not a nation state, because when it comes to matters of defense, which is one of the cardinal things, the United States is in charge of Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, just to name the fourth there. So one of the primary functions of the state is defense and intelligence, and that is actually quite centralized. So you have a situation, like in Africa is a very good example, 50 odd countries, broken, separated, unable to coordinate. And that, in a sense, is one of the dilemmas of the global south. And the methodological nationalism perpetuates that by thinking that the role of the academy is often to build up national biographies rather than to tell transnational stories. And I think that is really, really, really kind of important. And I think that is what is missing in the inability to see Islamophobia as a global rather than as a national phenomenon or regional phenomenon.
We have a number of questions, so if you could take a look at the question answer while I'm going to share the screen for the conference that you have.
Great.
As well as Reorient Journal for people to make sure that you actually, Reorient Journal is one of the really an important contribution, the Journal of Critical Muslim Studies. We think of it as a partner sister to the Islamophobia Studies Journal. We work together in both fields. So I encourage people who are listening and people who are with us to subscribe, to access the journal. I did leave the links on the chat. This is, again, it's a labor of love that is coming to try to make an impact and provide some grounding for the field. So I encourage people to, again, to access it. This is volume 5, number 1, autumn 2019, but you could access it, and it's actually all moving soon to open source, so you could access the journal across. So make sure to share it as widely as possible. And then the second part is the first international conference on critical Muslim studies, reorienting the post-Western. So I also put the links in there. Maybe Salman, you could speak about both the reorient as well as the conference, as you also answer the questions that are in the Q&A.
Okay. Do you want me just to answer the question, or do you want people to speak out their questions? How do you want to do it?
You answer the questions.
Okay, I'll just answer the questions. All right, let me try to put these together. Hatem said, access it, subscribe to it. I would also add, think about contributing to it. Be part of the project rather than simply a passive consumer of it. I think from all the things we've said is that, critical Muslim studies is also about empowering different voices. It's about engaging with it rather than simply kind of accepting it as a kind of logic. So it is an invitation as well to move through that. I've got a question just came up there about are we still accepting abstracts? The conference, because of COVID, has been now delayed till 7th of April 2021. We're hoping that, inshallah, that we will be able to have that conference in some sort of face-to-face form, because I think it's quite important. We will have some blended elements into it, but we still wanted to have the face-to-face possibilities in that. Now, if you are really, really interested in putting an abstract in for that date there, you can email still. We will look at them, but we can't, we've got quite a lot, so we can't guarantee acceptance, but we will certainly open to having abstracts, especially from places and about themes that we would want to, have not already been covered. So I would encourage you to do that if you're interested in doing that. I think there are a number of questions about Islamophobia, which I wanted to how to defend against Islamophobia, and I always feel very. I think, in general, I think the only way you can defend against Islamophobia is not necessarily recognizing that it is ignorance that drives Islamophobia. It's actually the lack of, what you need to understand is that Islamophobia isn't based on people knowing about Islam or Muslims. It's more they don't really care to know. You have to understand that Islamophobia is about a certain type of challenge there. So the practical things to do is really not that different from any kind of mobilization. And using one advantage that exists. If Islamophobes are going to globalize, you as anti-Islamophobes need to globalize. You need to start bringing these stories together. You need to connect up with these things. So I think that's what I would say to you is any kind of the only thing I would suggest at this point in time is that understand what Islamophobia is, and then build on the experiences of others contesting it. But understand that it is not something that you can resolve simply by talking about it in relation to the good Muslim or the bad Muslim kind of thing. That's just not really the issue here. I think there was a question also about, share your views on Muslim majority countries like Pakistan and Egypt, which inherited Islamophobia from the West. I think there is certainly a way in which the language of the war on terror and the protocols that have been put in internationally have helped facilitate an Islamophobic world system. And these protocols, so basically every single country can say that anyone that opposes its government is a terrorist. And there's a kind of a proliferation of that. Now, it seems to me that at some point we will reach an issue where you have to simply say that being called a terrorist doesn't make you a terrorist. You can't get into that kind of logic in there. And I think certainly the issue with countries like Egypt and Bangladesh, there's a sense in which what you need to understand is that the governments are not the people. And it's important to sort of remember that, and to try and recognize that the people need to be mobilized. They need to be engaged with. They need to need explanations, and they need to be part of that dialogue, what's happening to them. I think one of the biggest challenges anyone faces in any kind of trying to move to a better transformative project is both the kind of ability to see what is happening as being part of it's not natural, but contingent. It's something that has happened for a reason, not because it's always been the way. And then to see, well, what are the strategies of undoing that? So I think those are the kind of key strategies I will talk about. There's some more questions coming in. I'm just trying to keep up with them. Yeah, there's a question about Fanon. There is
a critique from the Global South or the Islamic Gate.
Yes. I think that there is actually quite an interesting article, and I've forgotten the name of the person who wrote it, but I put a reference to it. It's Islam, the Elephant in the Room, which basically looks at, would give you quite a good understanding of some of the challenges and around Fanon's view and understanding of Algeria and the role of Islam in that. And I think that's one part of it. I think there's a general part in which you have the relationship of Islam and Africa. That if you look at someone like Ali Mazari, and you'll see, or where what we call Africa is constitutive. Islam is part of it. It's not outside that construction. And I think it's important that we recognize that these kind of designations, Africa, Asia, Europe, Americas, these are not neutral designations. They emerge as a particular point in history by a particular kind of drawing of maps, for example. So it's important that we recognize what goes into these categories. And I think the way that you read Fanon as being problematic, I think, is to do with three things. Firstly, often his descriptions of what he considers to be sort of rural phenomenon, he leaves out the fact that they are kind of infused with the Islamic. He often takes, for example, the issue around, the Muslim women wearing hijab, etc., things like that, as simply a matter of resistance without thinking about the way through of that resistance there. It's the question of what he still belongs to a tradition in some ways, which is kind of a leftist tradition at that point, in which would see Islam as being a religion and religion requiring secularization to be progressive. I mean, that is the kind of churn that you can field into that. And I think it's worth being conscious of that. Right, there's a question about formation of
literary canon around Islamic Muslim identity can contribute to critical Muslim study.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'm not sure what I understand by the theoretical scope of such a research. I certainly think the kind of construction on recovery of a Muslim literary Muslimness can contribute to critical Muslim studies, but it depends on how it's done. I mean, look, you know, there's since the last 10 years, Muslims often appear on, you know, British and American TV. 9 times out of 10, they're either trying to, if they're a woman, they're trying to escape their faith. And if they're a man, they're probably helping the CIA, or they are the actual fanatic turned into that. So these are so it really depends on what kind of literary contribution you're going to make. And I think for me, another way of expressing aspects of this kind of project would be to think about it in terms of, does the literary production help enrich, elaborate the capacity of Muslims to write the history as Muslims? That, it seems to me, is a worthwhile, rather than just thinking about having a Muslim character. It's actually what the character represents, what it's sought to do, and, you know, not necessarily in any kind of singular way, in a complicated way. But I think that's really, really important. And I think cultural work is really, really important. I think right now, you know, the development of a global Islamic cultural milieu is actually already happening through, for example, hip hop, through other kinds of examples. And I think that's where one could see those kinds of tropes. Or Ertugrul, for example, you know, phenomenal impact of that TV series. As a kind of a recovery, not so much a recovery, but a rearticulation of a certain sensibility. And I think those kinds of projects are really, really important. The question about clearing. Yes, I mean, can you apply the clearing and dreaming methods to the Palestinian conflict? I suppose you can, but I don't think I'll be able to do it in the space of these questions there. But I think, look, the issue about clearing and dreaming is like I said, it's not a Muslim-specific issue. It is an issue to do with the global South, that in a sense, there's a division of intellectual labor. And that division of intellectual labor often means that theory comes from the North, ethnographic detail comes from the South. So the North interrogates and the South provides empirical answers. I think it's important to break that. And I think and part of the clearing of anything is simply to recognize that if you start talking about the global South, you are asked to speak in a particular way. And I think it's finding ways of refusing that speech. That, I think, is important. That's when you can dream. Or more specifically, if you're going to spend most of your time talking about whether the Prophet of Islam existed or not, it's not necessarily going to, if you're going to waste your energy on that, you're not going to be able to do other things that you want to do. So therefore, we shouldn't be caught up in having to address issues which are the part of the kind of psychodrama of the global North. I think the global South has enough of its own problems. I think Muslims have enough of their own problems that we don't need to try and cure other people's problems as well through our own experiences in a way. I think, is there anything that I've missed out? Oh, Shvetal. I don't know what time it must be in Australia. Do you see as an academic venture right now? I think of it as a intellectual and cultural venture. So yes, it is an academic venture and it has an academic part, which is, the journal primarily. It has more kind of popular fixations, which is, the blog. And as some of you know, there's a kind of a forbidden cinematic expression of that, everything you wanted to know about Muslims, but we're afraid to ask. So there are different kinds of permutations. And I think it's really, really important when we're trying to work in this kind of constrained space that we don't divorce the intellectual from the cultural, that we actually think of these things as moving together to trying to present a different view of a future for all of us. And that, I think, is really the part of a kind of you know, what struggle to establish a different understanding of the world, one that isn't utopian, that doesn't reject, that, you know, doesn't waste its time thinking about a world without power, because power is also productive, not just prohibitive, but it thinks and imagines different configurations of power. So I think that must be, you know, it has to be more than just an academic venture. What work within it would you specifically recommend? I'm open to suggestions on that. I mean, I think, you know, I'm a very bad reader in the sense that I find things in all sorts of places, which they speak to me, and that for me sort of resonates, and I'm okay with that. Others may find them completely odd and variant. So I think, so what I'm trying to say to you, that critical Muslim studies is not about discovering. It's also about reinterpreting, but it's also about building new material rather than just uncovering material that needs to be done. So, Gilberto, you know, you should be writing something rather than just, you know, that's what I would say.
So
I'd read that.
I think we're reaching to the end of our conversation. We could have went more. We're about hitting the 2 hours. But before we go, I wanted to direct your attention to our conversation on Friday. So we have one event on Friday with on Palestine, annexation, settler colonialism, and the Cairo's Declaration. And this is a conversation with Mitri Raheb. Is the founder and president of Dar al-Kalima University in Bethlehem. So this is again part of what we deal with in the US is Christian Zionism that often speaks and silence Palestinian Christians and speak on their behalf. So this is an event that will be a webinar at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 8 p.m. Palestine time. So make sure to register and attend if you are able. This is for this coming Friday. So really, I would like to thank, there was a large question. I don't know if you want to take it before we.
Yeah, there's one about, I think it's worth taking, which is about how do we stop critical Muslim studies becoming a buzzword, yes, and rendering it less meaningful. And I think, Claudia, the question you put there is a very important question, but the answer is that the only way you can stop it is by doing the work. I mean, in a sense that, to put it in a musical format kind of thing, when you have certain kind of musical innovation and sort of, then you often get lots of kind of plastic imitations. But I think it's the quality of the work that ultimately determines that. And it's the quality, the rigor of that. And I think so, to stop something rendering it meaningless is to recognize that if people are using it, it's kind of a recognition of the way it's resonating, but then also to understand that the way to deal with that is really through the work itself. That's what will make the difference in the end.
Thank you, Salman. It's been.
Thank you, Hatem. It was lovely, and thank you, everyone. I didn't, you know, it's been.
I saw Santiago was with us. Robert Bishara was with us. Roberto.
I know.
Jenna from South Africa.
Roberto just left.
Turkey. Sayyid Khan from Michigan. These are the people that.
I mean, you know what? This is almost like a virtual Berkeley, Granada kind of gathering. So
yeah, so for that. Thank you all for being with us. It's been enriching to have this conversation with you, Salman. We ask God to protect you and protect your family. May the days ahead be better, and may you know, we ask God to bring the cure and really provide safety and security for everyone. And we do look forward to the day we see each other in person. And for all of those who were with us, we look forward to seeing you in different places and different settings. And we'll say, Assalamu alaikum, goodbye, and look forward to seeing you again.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.